Hola, soy Berta Rojas y quiero darles la bienvenida al ciclo de conferencias La canción, nuestro retrato, presentado por Eureka 2021. Matt Dicken es estudiante de doctorado y profesor de Etnomusicología de la Universidad de Bath Spa, en el Reino Unido. Trabaja como profesor de guitarra en la Universidad de Bath Spa y en la Badminton School de Bristol. ¿Cómo termina un inglés interesándose en la música paraguaya? Y es que estudiando la maestría, Matt investiga la cultura de la guitarra en América del Sur y desarrolla este interés centrándose en la música de Agustín Pío Barrios Mangoré. Se fue enamorando de la música y la cultura paraguaya a tal punto que su investigación para el doctorado en etnomusicología se centra en la polca paraguaya. Matt explora cómo los jóvenes de Paraguay se identifican con la polca como influencia musical, con especial interés en cómo la polca está siendo vivida y recreada en el siglo XXI. Matt nos va a hablar esta noche sobre la polca paraguaya, reimaginando la tradición en la práctica musical creativa, reflexionando sobre su postura como investigador a través de la experiencia personal de hacer arreglos e interpretar música tradicional paraguaya desde la perspectiva de un extranjero. Agradecemos profundamente a Matt por esta valiosísima contribución al proyecto de Eureka. Que disfruten.
Thank you so much, Berta, for your introduction. It's a sincere honour to have been invited to speak at this wonderful event. As a non-Paraguayan, it is important for me to acknowledge my position as an outsider here and to express my perspectives as such, both as a researcher of Paraguayan culture and also a musician, spellbound by your national music and also seeking to explore my own understanding and approach to performance. I'll begin by presenting a central element of my research in Paraguay and outline briefly some of my interactions with creative practice. My research looks primarily at the Paraguayan polka and how it is embraced as a traditional music, and also how this tradition can move into new musical spaces in the 21st century. The processes that govern the evolution of musical traditions across time and within and beyond its cultural context dictate and challenge perceptions of relevancy in younger generations of musicians. How is a musical tradition reimagined so that it connects with a new audience, enters a new social space, and survives the omnipresent tests of time? The Peruvian scholar Raul Romero suggests that instrumentation is a malleable element and may set a parameter for how acceptable a reimagined musical tradition might be. In the case of his work in Debating the Past from 2001, Romero points to the fact that a clarinet might replace the role played by a quena in an orquesta típica in Andean Peru. The traditionalist approach would wrestle with this type of decision. But perhaps the concern here is that of pragmatism. What instrument is more functional or sounds better? However, the modernist will push this and ask the question of whether saxophones can also perform the role, not instead of, but in addition to the clarinet. Therefore, the parameters that the modernist perspective sets suggest that to some degree the change is like for like. Tradition and modernity may coexist, mingle, and blend in a variety of forms and meanings. The radical approach to reimagining tradition is through innovation, presenting ideas and perspectives as the next stage in musical evolution. Synthesizers instead of a harp, in the case of my research in Paraguay. I've looked to expand Romero's discussion of traditionalist, modernist, and radical, to explore a rationale to reinventing musical tradition that focuses on elements that are both musical and extra-musical. Is it only the intensely musical elements that give music its identity? From the performer or composer's perspective, which musical elements can be retained or removed when reimagining the music in a new way? What might be considered as a stylization or even a deformation of folklore? I'm looking to explore this practically in a structural way but also in an emotional sense. My first exploration into Paraguayan music came through Agustin Barrios. Here's a very short clip of the first video I shared and posted. My PhD research has enabled me to explore in greater depth the Paraguayan music that Barrios introduced me to, and I will start by explaining my initial reflections on the Paraguayan polka from the outsider's perspective. In its traditional form, the Paraguayan polka is polyrhythmic, often scored in 6/8, but with a strong sense of 3/4 in the bass line. Melodic phrases in the upper voice are frequently tied across the bar line. There is a characteristic syncopation that is created between the middle and lower voices, the effect of a ternary against a binary rhythm. However, for me as an outsider to Paraguayan music, creating a score in the way that my arrangement of Galopera shows is somewhat useless in defining this musical element of Paraguayan musical tradition, as to me, the syncopation feels so natural and less metronomic. So I'm already at a junction in my understanding. If I'm predisposed to think of musical building blocks or elements as fixed entities, or in this case, a written rhythmic motif that could be quantized and learned, then I'll only get so far with my understanding of the polka. Am I already reimagining this rhythmic element of the polka into my own adaptation by approaching learning in this way rather than by listening to what is perhaps a musician's personal expression of this rhythmic characteristic, a sincopado paraguayo, or in my outsider's understanding, something that seems to represent to rhythmic identity of Paraguayan music in a more complete way than the score can represent. This has presented a musical challenge to me. Performing is a key part of my methodological approach, listening and trying to understand the sense of natural syncopation, which feels slower, and between the quaver or the semi-quaver positioning. This is a short clip of Pájaro Chogui. I would like to thank Romy Martinez for her collaboration.
Cuenta la leyenda que en un árbol se encontraba encaramado un indiecito guaraní que sobresalía
In October 2019, I arrived in Asunción, and I have to thank Tanya Ramos for her help and welcoming me. Tanya introduced me to Remigio Pereira, and I've been able to discuss and learn about his approach to particular questions of rhythm and how he places elements of traditional music in his work. In this short clip, Remigio kindly allows me to listen to some of his orchestral compositions, igniting my thinking further around the importance of retaining particular musical features and combining two musical worlds.
Un universo de variables rítmicas, de variables armónicas y variables melódicas, que cada uno dentro de su contexto social fue desarrollándose. Esa es creo que una idea general de lo que es.
I understand that Paraguayicidad is a socio-cultural concept pertaining to national identity, the sense of Paraguayanness. Alfredo Coleman outlines this concept as synonymously in reference to a relationship between an ideal set of beliefs and values and an ideal historical past. Despite Lambert's politically centered 2010 definition that the 5 factors that have influenced Paraguay's historical development and identity are isolation, war, immigration, language, and land, Coleman, 2015, develops his view that the notion of Paraguayicidad has been redefined through the 20th century when socio-cultural values have become increasingly associated with Paraguayan traditional music. This is an area I will explore. Whilst researching and searching for books in Asunción, I became aware of Helio Vera as a writer and social commentator. The wonderful owner of this bookshop shown in the slide told me that he's well regarded in Paraguay for his humorous and intellectual critiques of the country's political constructs and offers a contrasting view on the connection between culture and national identity concepts. To quote, "Culture is, therefore, a process. It does not have much to do with the well-known concept of national being, which proposes the idea of a static and frozen whole, oblivious to the currents of time and the pressure of social realities. To attempt to understand this complex and varied discussion of Paraguayicidad, and perhaps explore Vera's thinking on the static and frozen whole and the pressure of social reality in relation to music, I asked the question of what musical elements must remain when a more radical approach is taken to reimagining the polka. Delis Ibarra is an electronic music artist and educator living in Asunción, creating electronic polkas. The video here shows a brief example of how Delis seeks to reconstruct the polyrhythmic elements of the polka using digital sounds.
Now in the drums I use the snare. Two parts now. like the polka, right? The traditional polka. And when you put this with electronic sounds, synth, and everything else, you got electronic polka.
Ana Laura Cardenas is also a young electronic music artist in Ascension. However, she inhabits a slightly different electronic space to Delis. When answering the question of which musical elements typical to the polka she feels most important to retain or represent when approaching this type of work, Anna cites her influences as sound elements of the harp, a 6/8 beat, or elements of nature such as running water or singing birds. Here's an example of Anna's work. Whilst musically, we're now viewing tradition through a slightly different lens. Perhaps it is in some extra musical feelings that the strongest connection to traditional polkas could be found. Notably, pájaro chogi and birdsong, for example. Communicating with musicians working in both traditional music groups and contemporary urban environments enabled me to develop a stronger understanding of how feelings of paraguayicidad are expressed in the production of music. I asked this question to Anna and she responded. In my personal opinion, I consider paraguayicidad as the friendship solidarity spirit of the Paraguayan people. Its most prominent feature. Through the polka or guarania, a kind of celebration and magnetism is generated that brings together the family and friendships. I arrived at a sketch of different musical elements that I had both learned from my own creative practice and also observed in the performance and recordings of others. There's also a reflection on elements drawn from a historical context that I unfortunately don't have time to discuss in detail in this presentation. However, as I've begun to observe the conversation around musical decisions in relation to mainly rhythm and melody, I've now been drawn to elements in the center of this diagram that seem to represent non-static, universal, and emotional elements in the polka. So I find myself considering this question as a general and central element of my research. I should say that I find some joy in writing this question when I think about Paraguay. For example, when I think of this question in relation to the UK, I would be writing if young people in the UK engage with traditional music, not how. But should young musicians be limiting their thinking when approaching traditional music? And does a classification of either traditionalist, modernist, or radical suggest music that's either good or bad in a traditional sense? I was very fortunate to attend the Festival de Tacoré in 2019 to add a counterbalance to my understanding. To me, as an outsider, I felt I was watching some amazing performances given by young people engaging with traditional music. And from the perspective of a traditionalist, however we might consider this as a modernist perspective in other ways too. In an interview with one of the festival organisers, Fidel, I posed a similar question to the one I asked Anna, and he responded, I feel paraguayicidad reiterates feeling. It is spontaneously, from my point of view, an expression of feeling through art. My framework of musical elements that pertain to the polka appear to sit somewhat awkwardly in my mind when I think only about rhythm, harmony, and melody. Whether I'm correct or incorrect, I find myself fixated on the extra musical, or perhaps more accurately, the emotional elements. With this in mind, whilst I was travelling to the Festival da Tacoré with the harpist Sixto Cobalan, he told me, when we arrive in Guamboré, you'll be able to feel the polka all around you. And he was correct.